Welcome to the new Healing Blindness podcast. We're going to go through in this first episode a very long explanation of a lot of different things, and I have no expectation this is going to get a lot of viewership. However, the goal is not for this original video to have large viewership or uh, commentary on it. Instead, it's to have one place where you can see many different pieces put together step by step. So what I'm going to do is take this and I'm going to cut it into smaller pieces so that different issues then are available for you to take a look at. But why healing blindness? Jesus asked a very important question when John the Baptist sent emissaries. Now remember, John the Baptist sent emissaries because he was imprisoned. He faced death. He had a basic question for Jesus. Are you the Messiah we've been waiting for? Jesus didn't tell him yes or no. He told the emissaries to look at the evidence. He said, do the blind see? Do the deaf hear? Are the lame healed? So he asked them to take a look at evidence. But interestingly, all throughout the Bible, blindness also is associated with an unwillingness to be able to take a look at what's around you, come to an understanding of what the truth is, and engage with reality, and therefore engage with God through the surroundings, through what's observable. So the point of all this is blindness is about not being willing to consider evidence that could lead to beliefs. If you have beliefs, getting stuck in those beliefs. So if you heal blindness, in theory, you cure the problem of not being able to see the world around you. If you can see, then you can contend with doubts. What is it I'm seeing? Do I understand it? If I see a furry animal running through the woods, is it a badger, a raccoon, a dog, a cat? I can see it, but not understand it. I can perceive its existence, but not perceive its character. And that's part of what we're going to try and do is deal with removing blindness so that we can actually understand what we see. The goal in all of this is to recognize the Christian's call to homage and fidelity through investigation. What's homage and fidelity? We'll talk about that, but those are core concepts. We're going to be talking a little bit about Deuteronomy 13 and 18, false prophets and true prophets, and what's the epistemology, what's the way of knowing prophetic truth in Judaism. Then we'll take a look at even Islam. How are Muslims supposed to determine whether to pledge homage and fidelity to a prophet, to Allah? And then we're going to take a look at Christianity and how fundamentally its method of figuring out the epistemologic, the how do you know questions about whether or not Jesus's gospel is true. The resurrection is the proof of his authority because he did prove himself master of death over the previous master of death, Satan. How did the Jews go about establishing proof? Moses went up on Mount Sinai with the assembly of elders, or the assembly of Israel, and was present with God in his throne room at Sinai. There might be some different interpretations of that, but the concrete story that's told, the baseline story, if you were reading it as a matter of fiction, what does the fiction literally say? Is a throne room on top of a mountain. It takes somebody who's a theologian to try and make sense of what that story says to try and figure out, well, what is the real point of all of it? And we'll talk about the underlying truth versus the point, the theologic conclusion, and why that's part of how you have an epistemologic analysis. So we've had Jesus on the cross as a method of proof. We have Moses and the assembly of elders going to the top of Mount Sinai as proof. So the question becomes, how does Muhammad provide divine proof of his divine authority to speak on behalf of God? What performative evidence provides an epistemologic, a method of knowing that we can trust that he was in fact speaking on behalf of God? But Jesus adds another layer. He says, not only do you want to know whether the prophet is true or false, but also when you do find a true prophet, what fruits does that prophet bear? We'll talk about what that means. But ultimately, the question is in Judaism, in Deuteronomy 18, it promised a future prophet greater than Moses. Was that Muhammad in Islam? Was that Jesus? Or was it something else? So let's jump right in here. We've got to start with the epistemologic. How do we know who to follow? Well, let's be very, very concrete here. We're talking about healing blindness. So we got to start with the question, what is real blindness? How does it impede our real life experience? Well, very basically, it helps us avoid obstacles. As we walk, we can look at things and avoid them that are in our way. It gives us the ability to perceive distant threats and opportunities. It gives us the ability to navigate reliably using environmental clues that could be 3 feet away or 300 million light years away, stars that we're looking at through a telescope. But to put it most simply, sight is our method of getting geographical knowledge. Where am I is the most fundamental question in learning. So there's your underlying foundation, why blindness and sight are so important. It's how we get oriented to everything else. If you're blinded, you struggle to get oriented. Now let's take a step back. We're going to be dealing with a lot of concepts here, so I'm going to lay out some foundations about how I'm approaching this. Some basic definitions and assumptions. First of all, the case study method is among the best means of learning. It gives the person the ability to learn about the world. You could have 8 well-chosen candidates for detailed, rich study, and you end up with far better understanding of the world than you do with the quote-unquote gold standard double-blind large population study. Why? Everybody says the large population study is better. The math is better. The stats are better. It just is better, right? Well, because it allows our minds to extrapolate and identify patterns at a human level. The ability is nearly universal. For example, if you're trying to teach a kid how to identify animals, learning age, we're talking about a kid that barely can speak, and they see a 4-legged animal running across the backyard. Well, what is it? Is that animal a dog or a cat? The first time you say it, oh, look, doggy. And so the kid quickly comes to the conclusion that any 4-legged animal running across the backyard is a doggy. So here comes a cat, runs across the backyard. Doggy! No, that's a kitty. That's a cat. Kid gets confused. Wait, 4-legged animal running across the yard, furry. How do I know doggy versus kitty? After several repetitions of seeing different dogs, different cats, different raccoons, and hearing these things, the kid doesn't need to see 1,000 different studies of dogs. He can start to extrapolate what the pattern of dog is and how it differs from what the pattern of cat is. That's learning by case studies. But in these supposed gold standard study methods that are nearly impossible for the vast majority of the population to perform for themselves because they're expensive, needlessly complex, mathematically dependent, multivariate factors of endless proportions. Oh, did I mention they're maybe built completely on statistical fallacies? And the study authors are so mathematically unsophisticated that they don't even know it? Can and do they serve purposes if they're well designed, if they avoid these fallacies? Yeah, absolutely. But probably far less effective than most people would believe. So if I'm a student and I want to learn as much as possible, as cheaply as possible, as rapidly as possible, which method am I going to give my greater attention? Well, the case study method doesn't sound too bad. A few quick case studies, you make some extrapolations, you got a rough idea of what's going on. Or what I would call the expensively nearly impossible method, or we'll call it ENIM, expensive nearly impossible method. Once you've selected your cases, what can you do with them? Well, you can observe, you can measure, you can experience. Yeah, you can do all that. You need information to analyze, categorize, and compare. What methodologies you choose is beyond the scope of this point. I mean, whatever you choose, there can be an infinite number of choices. But just choose a handful. Don't worry if they're the right ones or not. That's not the key point at the first step. The case study is so much cheaper than the ENIM that you can run numerous reiterations with different methodologies and hypotheses and never touch 1/10 of the budget of the ENIM. For engineers, they call this a Six Sigma mindset. So if you're really interested in learning more about how this would work, go look at Six Sigma literature. It'll tell you a lot. Now, once you have a working model, you can validate it, you can stress test the conclusion, you can play with it. So that's what we're going to be focusing on a lot, is the value of case studies as we go through this. And it makes sense. We're talking about three core religions, right? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. We're not talking about Catholicism versus Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, or Protestants, Methodists, Baptists, Anabaptists. Forget all that. We're going to keep in a very large scale point of view, and we're going to run these large categories on a case study basis. But you can turn around and do the same thing on each category and subdivide it into subcategories and do it over and over and over. You're going to end up with ever better results. My job is to give you a prototype. Your job is to then follow it through and analyze things using this type of method. Now, we also have the next vocabulary word we're going to be dealing with is causistic analysis. And I can never pronounce it right, so I'm going to put it up on screen so you can see the spelling of it, because it just doesn't compute for me. So there you go. There's how you spell it. But I'm going to say it as casuistic, okay? So when you hear me muddle my way through that word, you know what I mean. This is one of the highest methods of analysis, but it is so easy to mess up that philosophers have come to treat it as, well, it's a completely failed methodology. No, it's not a failed methodology at all. It's just very difficult to do well, and most people who try and deal with it make it far too complex far too early. So how do you handle it properly? Well, first of all, you got to be very, very careful about avoiding sloppiness, because that's when the fallacy arises. The difference is in the application of the method. Good analysis methods change conclusions rapidly. It works extraordinarily well with the case study method. In fact, I would argue it's completely dependent upon it. The casuistic method does not guarantee an immediate translation of your thoughts into the real world, but it is wonderful at giving you many ideas that you can experiment with to see if you can improve on things later. The casuistic analysis begins by explicitly describing the hypothetical key factors causing the existing situation. Without workably precise descriptions of the factors, nothing else is going to work. So the first step is to try and be precise at defining the parts of your analysis. With these factors described, you pretend to change one factor at a time. Notice, we're talking about a theoretical thought experiment. You experiment in real life. If you had the process, you'd take these factors and you'd change them as you go. But since we're doing thinking, We don't do it, we think about it, and we use reason to see what would change. So, for example, if I have a half liter of water and I assume there's a crack in the glass, I can imagine the water level will likely be affected by leakage. So I have a hypothesis that cracks cause water levels to fall. If I experiment with this across several different containers with different materials, I might find that cracked glass shatters so the leak is catastrophic, but a thick plastic cup may only weep. I'm managing which factor changes my conclusions. Maybe I could then heat the different containers to the boiling point. The glass may actually survive higher heats where the plastic melts and begins leaking badly. Strangely, a paper cup may only get singed. How is that? So as I've done this, I've begun to know the nature of containers better with only two factors analyzed. I could run test after test, trying paper cups with and without wax linings. I could get different types of plastics or different types of glass. But notice what I haven't needed yet. Lots of one type of glass container. I may never need it because I'm not an engineer designing a business's production line of glass containers. I'm trying to learn a rough lay of the land across many concepts. The enim, remember the expensive yada yada yada, begins to make more sense when I'm trying to make the air tolerance as tiny as possible. If I'm trying to do something that I need an engineer's level of precision, that it has to come out with the exact same tolerances every single time through, then I'm going to need to do more detail. But we're at the starting point. We're not ready for that yet. Nothing in this podcast, in fact, is likely to need those types of air tolerances. This is a bigger picture project. All right, our next term, Ceteris Paribus, a nice Latin phrase, so we can start sounding sophisticated. What does it mean? Well, it's often translated as all other things being equal. And for casuistic analysis to work in the case study method, you have to be able to temporarily ignore and hold in reserve other factors during the analysis while you're changing that one factor that you're focusing on. The goal is to suppress multivariate analysis as long as possible. In other words, if I only change one thing, one increment, I don't need to anticipate three or four things being affected, right? If we're talking about the glass of water, if I heat it and I break it at the same time, which one's causing the failure? Is it the heat on the plastic? Is it the shattered glass? By doing one thing at a time, I can narrow my thought process down to a simpler result. So this is often an artificial project. A crack in glass causes a leak, but we're analyzing the single factor of breaches in the container. We are not intentionally changing the water level. This is an effect of the cause that's being studied. We want to clearly see cause and effect. So to be able to do this, we have to assume if we change one factor, all other potential causation alternatives are not happening simultaneously. The biggest lesson is when we find a latent causal factor. That is, a factor that we failed to identify at the beginning that remained hidden or latent, as opposed to patent or patent, which is obvious, available to be seen. Every time we change a factor, this latent factor is actually causing the change. With a glass of water, for example, if we break glass, put on a high flame, but still get minimal leaking, what could be the problem? What if our problem had been left in the cold overnight? It's water, but not liquid. It's ice. The latent factor, remember, hidden from our listed factors, not necessarily observation. So we could see the ice, but it wasn't part of our analysis. We started with ice in a solid form rather than water. So in chemistry, there's often a Ceteris Paribus called standard temperature and pressure, or STP. Experiments always start from the same point, unless specifically stated otherwise. So you get to assume basic information. It doesn't become instantly complex, it's instantly simple. By assuming ceteris paribus conditions in all conversations and analyses, we can provide some immunity to many fallacies like whataboutism, or also known as tu quoque, or well, you do it too, or the forest and trees, or the genetic fallacy, or a false choice fallacy. The steps are small, and the cause and effect connections are easier to track. Sudden introduction of additional variables when conclusions are undesirable are rejected immediately as attempts to obscure the lesson's conclusion. Now let's take a step back. We've assumed that casuistic analysis is good. Well, what about this notion that it's a fallacy? Blaise Pascal, the famous French philosopher from the Enlightenment, complained that the Jesuits, the order of Catholic priests or monks, were using casuistic analysis to end up answering moral dilemmas with outcomes that justified immoral behavior. So in philosophy, the casuistic fallacy is an overly complex analysis to support a dubious conclusion. And you got to say, Pascal's complaint is justified. Taking one changed factor and looking at it through the outcome through many layers is an abuse of what I'm suggesting. It essentially multiplies the numbers of variables that could be analyzed, and often ignoring potential contribution of latent factors. If you ignore the possibility they might introduce these factors, you're going to completely end up with a bad conclusion. To avoid Pascal's complaint, casuistic analysis must be extraordinarily precise and incremental. It needs to adjust one factor at a time, then return it to the larger context. Then you consider the next increment of that factor's effect, or the next factor. Anytime the recontextualized larger picture gives results that make no sense in the real world, the analysis fails. It doesn't mean we don't learn, but the analysis didn't tell us what the answer is. This acceptance of failure is the key to avoiding Pascal's complaint. Logic does not tell us right or wrong. It tells us correlation and causation. As David Hume, the philosopher from the 1700s and friend of Adam Smith, said, the is tells us nothing about the ought, and vice versa. Meaning, just because something is doesn't tell us what it should be, and what should be doesn't tell us what is. Jesus tells us to consider whether the self-proclaimed prophet's predictions produce good fruit or poisoned fruit. If it's a poisoned fruit, the tree is to be chopped down and burnt. In this case, the line of reasoning must be discarded. The Jesuit failure that Pascal was pointing out was the failure to chop down and burn the source of poisonous outcomes. Instead, Pascal accused them of falling in love with the poisonous tree and calling the fruit good. This is a delusion, not a sound conclusion. By moving slowly, incrementally, and reiteratively, not going long swaths of logical connections, we have multiple possible learning opportunities along the way. Pascal's complaint is not entirely removed, but it loses its significance. Okay, that's the starting point. Now let's start digging into why is sight and blindness so imperative if we're trying to talk about geographical orientation. How does sight impact geographical knowledge? Why is geography fundamental to understanding? Well, in psychology, it's called cognitive search. What is cognitive search? Basically, it's the whole process of searching your mind for old memories. How do we store those memories? How does this connect to geography? We'll try and clarify that. But let's look at a failed cognitive search first. If we try and recall a memory and it doesn't come, was it a wasted effort? Well, if it tells us we're looking for the idea in the wrong place, we may need to run to a new territory to scavenge for a higher probability of success. What does that mean? Well, all that vocabulary started with psychologists using trials with mice. So the vocabulary is describing what the mice did as they were running around in the mazes. They wanted to figure out, when did the mice determine when to stay in one room in the maze and look for the food pellets in that room, and when did they decide to run through the maze to the next room. So you have the choice of run or scavenge. What happened was the mice would end up in anger and disappointment when they didn't find food pellets where they expected it. So they ended up with a dopaminergic dopamine that everybody talks about it as if it's the happy um, um, endocrine effect. But that's not really an honest description of it, but we'll leave that for now. But generally, if you have dopamine, you feel good. So if you're angry and disappointed because you don't find the food pellet where you expect it, you have a failed expectation. And so the classic solution is to run away from that problem and seek a new territory to scavenge or to avoid whatever's causing the problem. Personally, it relieves unconquerable problems and allows new scavenging as quickly as possible. Misapplied running is basically a phobic avoidance. It allows you to ignore scavenging opportunities for psychological benefits. But properly applied, it maximizes the optimal opportunities to scavenge effectively. So we've seen that dopamine plays a role. There's another endocrine effect that plays a big part too, and that's serotonin. If you get dopamine and serotonin working together, you end up with a successful physical search. So that's how we're going to distinguish this. When we're talking about a mouse type situation where you're moving around in geography, we'll describe it as physical search. When we're talking about recalling ideas, we'll talk about it as cognitive search. So in scavenging, dopamine creates a high in anticipation of success. I've just about got it. Now notice, I didn't say when you have success. It's the anticipation of success. It's the hope springing anew at that last moment. When the hope is fulfilled, you're encouraged to repeat the behavior in order to get the same high. But it never comes exactly that way. You do get positive reinforcement as long as the hope is fulfilled, just less with every repetition. Then no reward comes with habituated response. It's no longer a thoughtful and considered process for the gray matter of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. It's now automated white matter of the brain, the cortex, which is more down in the middle layer of the brain. The habituated response, getting the positive result, becomes satisfying and comforting that life is on an even keel. The status quo is stable and consistent. So you end up getting a surge of serotonin. You feel satisfied. Dopamine and serotonin in failed physical search is a whole nother matter. I'll tell you, the best thing you can do if you want to know more about this is go listen to Andrew Huberman or Jordan Peterson's podcasts. They're the professionals in this subject. So I'm just going to do a basic introduction. Their podcasts do a far better job of laying out the nuances of this. But we'll just start with dopamine. When we anticipate success but get failure, then we have a dopamine crash. And we are very, very sensitive to dopamine going down. It feels physically painful because we use the neural pathways for physical pain and pleasure to transport the virtual experience of emotions. Emotions don't exist independently. There's no second neural pathway for happiness and joy or frustration and anger. Anger is the absence of dopamine, like a shadow or darkness is an absence of light. Bursts of anger often come as a sudden surprise of unanticipated anticipated dopamine that never arrives. It feels painful. Think like Pavlov's dogs. That's what he was studying. Then you have cortisol. The brainstem surges cortisol to heal the psychological pain when things don't go as you expect. It's as if the physical pain is indicating a physical injury. So it sends up physical defense mechanisms of freeze, fight, or flight. It's the same situations as Pavlov's dogs that did not get the food that they had anticipated. Then serotonin. This is the anger and negative surprise that destabilizes serotonin output. Anxiety results. Anxiety is essentially the absence of serotonin. Like a shadow or darkness is an absence of light, or anger is the absence of dopamine. Think of the dog who doesn't get food at a well-established and scheduled time. He starts getting anxious near dinner time. In contrast, if you have a dog like mine that has food laid out nearly every day at every hour, they lose their food motivation. They just go do their thing and eat when they want to. They feel satisfied that everything is going to be okay. They don't need the next round of food so desperately. When we scavenge a known territory and fail to find anticipated items, like the classic example of hunter-gatherers and looking for berries to eat, the first thing that happens is we go negative on dopamine. This causes us to distrust the existing habituated search practices. We may fruitlessly pursue old habits because we yearn for dopamine, but our serotonin crashes, anxiety arises, anger is not necessarily set in yet, but we begin to fear and become frantic. We may search faster and faster in old places with no improvement of outcome. If we stay in the same scavenging territory, this becomes a psychological death spiral. Now let's return back to the mouse mazes with the room seeking food. If you have the mouse scavenging excessively in the same place repeatedly, they can end up suffering anxiety and anger without really leaving the same area. This is a sign of cognitive collapse. A key step in the process has ceased to function. Excessive scavenging in a non-productive location is a sign of cognitive dysfunction. Repeated behaviors that are unproductive are a symptom of this problem. So, obsession with doing these unproductive behaviors is a worsened form of the same symptoms. The behaviors are automated and self-soothing, but they're frankly pointless. This obsession with action can become virtual too. The mind may deal with the necessaries of the day like eating, sleeping, and relieving, but still think obsessively about the problem of failed scavenging. New strategies and methods may be dreamt up. Old strategies and methods may be analyzed and dissected obsessively for possible problems that hadn't existed in the past. If the person goes out to scavenge again in light of this thinking and tries new methods or adapted versions of old methods, discoveries can occur. Scavenging may become productive again. Dopamine surges back. Serotonin increases incrementally. It's slower in reacting, but anxiety still lurks in the background. However, if that new method or adaptation thoroughly fails, dopamine and serotonin decline again. This dissect and decline leads to continual analysis and anxiety. The dangerous divide is when the mind starts blinking. I am a failure. I am a failure. I am a failure. No actions proposed. No solution proposed. Just a hard and fast conclusion that offers no new solution for scavenging. This is ruminating depression. It is potentially deadly because it freezes a person. How do you escape this type of thorough scavenging collapse and depression onset? What's another label for such ruminating obsessiveness? Opportunity blindness? You cannot see other possibilities, so you dwell on the only possibilities with which you are historically familiar. In Hebrew, there's a concept when you talk about this where the word is lodging. So if you start grumbling, you lodge yourself in this notion. So you're locked in place. So we think of grumble as being words spoken. The Bible suggests it's deeper than just saying negative things. If you choose not to look for new ways to solve the problem, your brain habituates the existing surroundings and they literally disappear from your perceptive capabilities. You become functionally blind to your surroundings. Let's take an example. Imagine walking into your bedroom where you have lived for 10 years. If everything is as you left it for the last 3 years, whether messy or OCD orderly, doesn't really matter. You will have a high tendency only to notice what is different than the habitual pattern. Now, a messier person may not search for deviations and may not be able to notice slight deviations as easily. On the other extreme, an OCD personality may automatically scan for any possible deviation and notice the slightest nuance of deviation, or physically touch different items to add an additional method of perception. Maybe there's a small deviation that my eyes cannot perceive, but my fingertips can. Either way, what is noticed is what the person perceives as a deviation. It is not an individual definition of deviation, but it is the deviation that matters nonetheless. The deviation is definable only by being able to ignore what is not different. Ceteris paribus, all the things being equal, your brain will not notice what is always present. So now we have blindness because we don't act, depression. We have functional blindness because we cannot perceive what is always there. So let's talk about the uselessness of excess scavenging when you're functionally blind. To this point, we have discussed what happens when you become habituated to a location's appearance. You may see, but you don't perceive the unchanged. It almost disappears from your perceptive abilities. Now, we have discussed when we excessively scavenge the same location over and over, hoping to find new resources like berries. We become anxious, angry, and potentially depressed. How do we break those problems? When you're looking for berries and none are to be found in your current location, you move to a new field. Hopefully no one else has already scavenged there, especially not a bear. Now, any berry discovered might give you a new dopamine hit. When you see the berry bush leaves, you may have hoped that a closer examination will lead to discoveries of berries. Even so, if you find nothing, you move on rather quickly to seek new bushes. You often move around very quickly in hopes of doing a quick survey. You want to find the best candidates for a more careful scavenging. Since you have already moved fields once, if this field fails to cause scavenging to be successful, you're more likely to move to a third field in rapid succession. You want an abundant opportunity for deep scavenging. If you succeed in the strategy, you will have a new series of new dopamine hits in rapid succession. What are you doing by moving from field to field? Then remember, this is the physical search we're talking about. Now, in the cognitive search vocabulary, they discuss this in the mouse maze as running to the next room in the maze where the food pellets can be hidden. In that room, he scavenges, and he gives up, he runs to the next room. So moving from field to field is called running. Cognitive search then is described as the alternating process of thinking in two different patterns, scavenging and running. While you run, you may be searching too, but primarily you're moving to a new mental location. Then you can scavenge your memories like a mouse scavenging for food pellets. And here's the fundamentally geographic nature of retrieving memories and being creative, which is dependent on memory retrieval. You focus on one idea or subject until you run out of strategies to scavenge more memories. Then you run to a new idea or subject to act as a new stimulus to retrieve memories. The more your thinking process is organized in a geographic and chronological, think storytelling, fashion, the stronger your memory connections will be, and the easier it'll be to retrieve your memories on demand. Why? Because our thinking pattern is still just a mouse running a maze. You're either scavenging or running. When you retrace the same memories and the same stimuli over and over and over, you end up developing a mental desensitization of memories. Consider when you lost your keys in your house. You first just look randomly. You don't find your keys after hunting for a few minutes. Then you remember your mother's suggestion. Just retrace your steps, dear, from when you last remember having your keys. How many times have you retraced your steps and realized you left your keys in your jacket pocket? The geographic trace and chronological reliving the experience made you sensitive to details that you have recently just been blind to perceiving. You had never opened the closet door in your search because you don't keep your keys in the closet. Yet the step retracing made the closet suddenly very significant. We often become mentally blinded when we focus on the mental patterns that we follow every day. We cannot imagine retracing our steps and considering how those mental patterns were established. Some of those mental patterns go all the way back to childhood. To retrace those steps in creating the mental patterns may go past our first childhood memories. How can I retrace a step that I can't remember? If you can't remember a childhood memory about why you have a mental pattern, does that mean that your mental pattern should be immune from an adult re-examination? That seems an odd theory. That would lock us all in childish habits and avoid learning any new lessons as an adult. That's clearly wrong. So mental patterns learned in childhood probably should be re-examined and updated from time to time as we mature. But since these are the mental patterns that we are likely the most habituated to be blinded, they're also the hardest to identify without creating a dopamine or serotonin crash. This dopamine crash is crucial. It sets off the cortisol surge. Remember the panic, the stress hormone? Because it opens the learning circuits. If anger from the left hemisphere rises sufficiently, it shuts down the learning process. It slams the jail cell door and throws away the key recklessly. Anger jealously guards the jail cell and kicks away any visitors. Anger activates the entire body in a rage through your neural networks. Adrenaline surges for a time. But then anger exhausts energy resources at a tremendous rate. The body is tense and requires constant muscle tension. The mind is racing, burning up the brain's glucose supplies, its energy supplies. When anger finally subsides enough, at least to allow fitful sleep, the body can recharge its energy supplies. But what happens while anger remains in charge between bouts of exhaustion? New intelligence, like military spying, arrives. The brain processes it as a form of dissecting a potential enemy attack. The effort is focused on finding one's weaknesses and plotting strategic and tactical counterattacks. There are two different labels for this. We can call one the Ares Mars mode or the Athena and Minerva mode. If you know your Greek mythology, Greek Ares or Roman Mars was the god of war and battle lust, accompanied by his companion gods or goddesses, Eris and Ino for strife, twin sons Phobos, fear, and Deimos for terror, and they drove Mars' chariot. Other attendants were Kaidoimos, chaos or the din of war, famine, rage, anger, threats, death, and valor. Essentially, Mars was the god of the nihilism and passionate chaos of war. He was rarely a patron god, but more of a taskmaster. In contrast, the Greek Athena, or Roman Minerva, was the goddess of strategy and organization of a military at war. She required wisdom, cleverness, and patience. She was the trickster Odysseus's patron goddess. So, going back to our anger issues, anger is essentially the tool of a Mars mode mindset. Anger prevents the Athena mindset from arising. This sounds contradictory because I suggested earlier that anger was one looking for strategies to counterattack and to plot. Mars mode is much more about personal gain in battle, not the welfare of the entire army. The leadership of the army is Athena mode. Warriors with a battle lust are the enemies of an Athena mode battle plan. When Mars mode goes to sleep exhausted, maybe later a nagging curiosity digs out the key to the jail cell of the learning process from under the refrigerator. Curiosity may creep in and unlock the door of learning's jail cell and just peek inside. If a discovery is made, dopamine returns. The smaller the discovery, the more innocent the process, the less likely they're going to wake up anger and have it resurge. Mars mode remains at bay. The left hemisphere of the brain's constant seeking of tactical advantage is laid aside. When curiosity can creep around the perimeter like a mouse exploring new terrain and preparing to scavenge, learning is underway. The moment of truth is when a new discovery is made. If curiosity continues, dopamine and serotonin have a chance to allow learning. But if anger and defensiveness awake Mars mode, learning is thrown back in jail. Excuse me. So you see, anger and anxiety lead to cognitive blindness. Cognitive blindness is that jail cell that prevents learning. Cognitively and physically running to a new scavenging site can be a solution for anxiety and anger. The best way to escape anger and anxiety of Mars mode is to seek new terrain to explore. The mind feels an urgency to learn the new geography, but it invites exploration and fresh examination. If the person remains frantic, a new location for anxiety and anger accomplishes less than nothing. It often spreads negativity to new locales. The person remains blind and may actually cause other people to join them in that blindness. Finding the new locale is intriguing and a bit bewildering, allows many learning opportunities. The mind must take in new geography and situations at a rapid rate. As long as anxiety can be suppressed, anger struggles to grab a foothold. The person is at least momentarily open-eyed and observant. So running to a new geographic location or cognitive search opportunity allows a change to look at the situation afresh. Continually and intentionally returning to geography and territory exploration helps avoid blindness to new areas of exploration. It gives us a vocabulary that our brains can understand to trigger learning opportunities. Now, that's kind of the close of some basic psychological principles. Now we're going to take a leap and move back into the theological realm here. This whole process I've just described fits theological discussions extraordinarily well. When a person grows up in a faith tradition, they often learn the ancient scholars' conclusions first. In Christianity, a child is told Jesus is our Savior and Lord. Does that child know what a Savior or Lord is yet? As he learns the concepts, he's simultaneously learning what the terms mean. Often in these religious situations, which includes a child growing up in an atheist or anti-theist household too, the child learns how to defend the parent's idea as new objections are learned. How does this pattern fit with the run and scavenge model? Arguably, it doesn't. The child is more like a little bird chick holding its mouth open, waiting for mama bird to regurgitate the pre-digested idea into their mouth. The chick makes no effort to feed itself or learn the territory where the food was scavenged or hunted. If this chick spends a lifetime only consuming regurgitated ideas, there is no exploration or learning that allows independent thought and learning. To make matters worse, the chick may not realize how dependent it is on mama bird. When it flies off to play, does it seek to role-play the role of hunter or scavenger? Or does it fly off to fly loops in the air but return home for mama bird to feed him? With modern religious students, the atheists in the academy have suffocated most any serious independent exploration of religious ideas. Everyone is simply consuming regurgitated ideas from sectarian scholars long since dead. When these chick-minded religionists presume to be gifted hunters and explorers, but only consume regurgitated ideas, they are actually blind. They cannot see themselves as others would see them. And remember, at the very start of this, I talked about John the Baptist. Let's rewind back to that story. When John the Baptist was imprisoned and at risk of being executed by Herod the Tetrarch, he sent emissaries to Jesus to confirm whether Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. John, who had first proclaimed Jesus, had his doubts at the end. What was Jesus' answer? A reprimand for doubting? Nope. After the emissaries watched Jesus in action, Jesus tutored the emissaries on how to respond. Jesus told them to report what they had witnessed. He said, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them." Now, this is from Luke 7:22. You also see it in Matthew 15:30. And these are often quotes from Isaiah 29:18, 35:5 and 6. Mark 7:35 goes into this a bit, but what's interesting as a theological side note is the messianic apocalypse that we discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls in 4Q 521, fragment 2, Roman numeral 2, line 12. I think I got that right. It's the only place that proposes that lepers being cleansed was a messianic expectation. So it's interesting. Jesus inserted another standard when he was describing what the emissary should report. Simply put, what did Jesus say? Tell John what you saw, compare your observations to what the Messiah should be. John will understand the promise has been fulfilled, and more. And more. Jesus had gone above and beyond the standards that most of Torah and the prophets would suggest. Jesus didn't tell them to believe. He had the emissaries witness, then report their testimony. Let's break that down, because this is crucial to what we have to say going forward. Jesus wanted them to see, recall the pre-existing established standard, compare the evidence witnessed to that of the existing standard, then and only then reach a conclusion as to Jesus' status. This is a lesson in good casuistic analysis and epistemology. Observe, select an existing knowledge as a yardstick for comparison that is appropriate to the circumstances. That's key. It has to be appropriate to the circumstances. Then measure the observation against the yardstick. Analyze the measurements and report your findings. Why is this relevant to casuistic analysis? Because Jesus listed the different facts that could be true or false. Did the blind see? True. Did the deaf hear? True. Were the lepers cleansed? True. Did the dead rise? True. Did the poor hear the good news? True. All the criteria are met. If one of those had been false, and you'll see me in some of my writings, nota bene, note well, this is a casuistic question. If one of those had been false, what would be the consequences? Would Jesus have proven himself to meet all the criteria of being the Messiah? Nope. What that would have meant if the proof was incomplete, once again, another casuistic question, could he have been the Messiah without all the evidence of the yardstick? For a strict interpreter of the rules, no, he would not have been. For a looser interpreter, yeah, we can let that slide because he's almost there. But Jesus met all the criteria of the yardstick that he himself proposed. This is a key method of legal argumentation. Presenting the rule which you propose should be the yardstick to determine the legal conclusion. Jesus proposed an existing yardstick that was more stringent than the Old Testament in Isaiah. Jesus added cleansing lepers from the Messianic Apocalypse, a non-canonical Second Temple book. Jesus proposed a rule that arguably could have allowed the emissaries to observe and measure, while finding Jesus fell short of the standard of measure. Jesus invited the emissaries to look closer and truly see deeper than they would have before Jesus offered a stricter standard of measure. Jesus invited not only sight, but examination of the evidence that they saw. So we might say the Christian standard of examination is observing reality and using a tighter standard of measure than most would expect to see if truth can withstand the greater examination. How do we know the Christian examination is more demanding? What do we have to compare against? We've already discussed that Isaiah, as one prophet, was less stringent on the issues than what Jesus proposed. What if the Messiah was to be a prophet? What criteria would he have to meet in Torah? Deuteronomy 13 tells us that false prophets seem to speak for God, may even do miracles, but the criteria is making predictions about the future that do not come true. If predictions fail, he is a false prophet, and the punishment is execution. Side note, in ancient Middle East customary law, the full range of punishments were not published, only the maximum penalty. The judges could impose lesser penalties at their discretion. So a penalty of death could allow capital punishment or banishment from the city. Either way, the false prophet was encouraged to leave of his own volition. If he was not present to appear before the court, he could not create more trouble in the city. Either way, the problem was put to an end. So, end of side note. Since a key part of law is to dissuade future crimes, this provision discourages argumentation based on, well, God told me this or that would happen. The fallacy of appeal to divine authority was heavily discouraged. Argumentation had to rely more heavily and more substantively on argumentation methods. Psychologically, a false prophet who suffered from delusions of grandeur or God syndrome were systematically treated as heretics, more worthy of death than of following. The mentally ill were not desirable leaders. Religiously, a false prophet could be identified as a possible sectarian divider. He was less likely to serve the community well and promote shalom, covenantal peace, relationship between people. So what then is a true prophet? One who accurately predicts the future and does miracles. So the talented and the clear-eyed were to be trusted. Sight for the seeing is rewarded with loyalty and following. Judaism has other criteria for the Messiah. Whether those criteria existed at the time of the Maccabees, Herod's temple, or Maimonides is worth discussion, which is beyond the scope of this video. So too are the full list of criteria for the Messiah. Judaism expects prophets to prove their ability to speak with God's authority and voice. Would Muhammad meet those criteria? Possibly, if you skip the Quran and jump to the Hadith, but as being a prophet, the basis for establishing a relationship with God biblically? No. This is where Islam fails massively and exposes Muhammad as a false prophet without any authority to implement new divine rules on anyone. Prophets' jobs in the Bible were to interact with God and keep the people on the straight and narrow with existing covenants with God. They were essentially the equivalent of censors in the Roman Republic. They pointed out when constitutional authority had been broken and declared the act unconstitutional. Notice this is not a judicial function like the U.S. Supreme Court. This is a religio-bureaucratic function. Hold the analysis for a minute on Moses' role as a prophet. Consider the other prophets. Did any of them repeal Mosaic law? Did any add significant obligation to Mosaic law? No, they added minor requirements like publicly reading the Torah aloud once every 7 years. Yes, rabbis claim oral Torah, but I'm ignoring that. Read 2 Chronicles 34:14 and the rest of the chapter on the forgotten law of the written Torah and its reestablishment under King Josiah in the 700s BC. If the written Torah was forgotten, how can the oral Torah be remembered accurately? It doesn't compute. Moses spoke to God, but did his conversations as a prophet make the Torah binding on the people of Israel? No. The elders of Israel met with God in his throne room, come down to the mountaintop. In God's presence, the assembly, or the assembled elders of Israel, entered into covenant with God. Moses did not enter into the covenant with God. Representatives of the 12 tribes of Israel did. Christians and Jews have events to witness that require looking and seeing. Blindness is what prevents this necessary step from happening. The goal of my analysis is not to answer major theological questions. The goal is to determine the best approach to examining the evidence for a religious proposition. I am encouraging wide-eyed observation in comparison to selected and described yardsticks before the analysis is done, then reporting the results of the analysis. If the analysis does not answer all the questions once and for all, change the question, run the analysis process again. Then you'll narrow the gap. Now let's consider the Islamic approach. Does it actually depend upon maximizing the blindness of the believer? The Quran, and it's in Surah 7, 172, Surah 5, 7, Surah 2, 27, 3, 81, 16, 91, 33, 7, and 2, 40. Constantly talk about covenants, breaches of covenants, obedience to covenant, and loyalty to covenant. But it never says what the covenant is. It just incorporates by reference some undefined Christian and Judaic covenants. The researcher Odin Lafontaine, or Odin LaFontaine, if you're an American, describes the person who wrote the Quran as the preacher. And the preacher describes the source of the Quranic material, but never defines the terms of the covenant. He never describes where the covenant was adopted, nor does the preacher inform us who participated in the cutting of the covenant. This source material is attributed to, as LaFontaine calls it, Muhammad defined by the preacher, or MDP. As to MDP, the preacher tells us to obey MDP, as he is known to be a prophet. How do we know? He's the seal of the prophet, of the prophets, in Quran 33:40, as he confirms prior messengers. True prophets are divinely protected, infallible, sinless from birth, according to Quran 7:2. They perform miracles, emphasize monotheism, and confirm prior descriptions and corrected distortions, according to Quran 381, 1636. They exhibit truthfulness, detachment from worldly greed. For example, the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, where MDP distributes wealth without keeping any, and moral purity, often living simply, for example, surviving on dates and water per Sahih Muslim. False prophets, for example, I think I can pronounce this properly, Dajjals, Dajjals, or liars, are those who claim prophethood after Muhammad, or MDP, contradicting his finality, including the hadith warning of about 30 such claimants before Judgment Day. They seek personal gain, contradict monotheism or prior revelations. They lack miracles or moral integrity. They introduce distortions or fail to align with universal message of submission to Allah. So the people have no participation in accepting the rules by entering into a covenant. The qualities of the prophet himself are supposed to tell us he is a prophet. There is no objective standard of measure, only a measure that applies to MDP himself. Everyone else must measure against him, completely subjectively. Notice the difference with Jesus. He told John the Baptist's emissaries a standard of measure outside of himself should be used, then use their own eyes to validate the compliance with the proposed standard. The emissaries were allowed to judge God incarnate as equals. They were invited to see and witness. Islam not only does not, as a seeker, ask a seeker to see, it actively blinds the seeker. Finally, we can come to the key point. The preliminaries are in place. Here's the basic storylines of the three so-called Abrahamic faiths. I only admit two of the three in truth. Judaism offers agreements or covenants to people to which the Jews in their own Tanakh, or Torah, prophets, and Psalms, meaning all of the writings after the Psalms, to which the Jews are miserable failures. Prophets keep coming to attempt to discipline the Jews and bring them into line. The prophets cajole them to open their eyes to see the truth, albeit with not much success. Many prophets were recorded as killed, including unnamed prophets of the, quote, school of the prophets, unquote. Many others have non-canonical traditions of their having been killed by other Jews. Rather than look and see, the Jews sometimes killed the prophets, calling the people to look and see the truth. Jesus offers forgiveness for those failures, including failing to look, if Jews just loyally follow him. Christ demonstrates his compliance with the original covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Israel, and Moses. He dies for the Jews' failures first and foremost. Many Jews accept Christ's offer. Many more do not. Gentiles are then invited to be, quote, grafted in Paul's words, to Christ's new covenant of mercy, even though they are now required to follow many of the moral laws that only the Jews had to follow before. Jesus offers a process for witnesses to see. Then he expands the audience of seekers invited to look, see, witness, then testify to others. Legalistic evidence sharing, but fully dependent on an attempt to seek and see. Muhammad is defined by the preacher, or MDP, has no idea what the covenant is, but will punish you if you break it, demands you obey him, and makes all the rules using himself as a yardstick for mankind. His followers are constantly deprived of any means to see and witness anything independently. There are no standards applicable to all. MBP or MDP has special rules for himself, like 11 wives, when all other men get 4 or less. His young wife Aisha even claims in a hadith that Allah seems overly interested in pleasing MDP's whims of the moment. She is effectively witnessing the lack of standards and how what MDP claims to witness is very, very self-serving. How does each seeker of a faith come to believe that faith in the first place? As I noted above, most have no idea. They learned it in the cradle from their parents. They've never not been of the faith. These cradle believers often have never considered their faith. They are blind puppies, even if 80 years old. They have never seen independently. They trust someone else to tell them what to believe and what to do. Many today are cradle believers, but lost their faith due to an atheist teacher or professor running a Maoist re-education camp on them in school or struggle session. The believer was embarrassed, so lost faith. No matter whether they could see before, they had scales fall over their eyes. They became blind atheists, like Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus. Some of these blind atheists are loud, proud, and verbose. They may become accomplished Socratic interrogators and offer scales like Girl Scout cookies to anyone who will listen. They seek to snuff out any light to allow sight at all. Then there are the regular worship attendees who know almost nothing about their faith. They cannot tell the merits or demerits of competing sects or denominations. They don't care. Religion is something they do to fit into culture. They are blind as to who moves around town in fixed patterns with their canes guiding their path. If silent obstructions to their walks emerge, they may not discover it until the last minute. The few and resolute are those who come to their religion after deep study of their own faith, and often others, including atheism and anti-theism. They often drift through agnosticism along the way. All believe that they can see without any blindness. Yet large parts disagree vehemently on many fronts, especially interfaith fronts. Only one of these groups will prove to be correct in the end. They are the ones whom we don't realize can see the best. So how does a blind man assess another man's sight? Only a sighted man can assess another man's sightedness or blindness. The sighted man is at least able to see the yardstick and the target many yards away. Jesus sought to make his followers like a city on a hill that all can see from far away. Matthew 5:14. Add a few lights at night, and the city truly stands out. Should truth be available only to a benighted people? Why should no other people share in truth that can be seen for miles? Strangely, Christianity has a better explanation for the existence of the house of Israel than does most post-2nd century Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is a faith for a bloodline. Christianity says Judaism was to be an example and guiding priest for the Gentiles to follow, just as Christ did. Islam seeks to punish everyone who is not a Muslim, so that Muslims run the world. Everything else is just an excuse to promote Muslims into authority. Rape? Good if against non-believers. Slavery? Good if against non-believers. Murder? Good if against non-believers who do not allow Muslims to come to power. Islam is happy if all non-Muslims are blind and cannot resist. The problem in Islam is how profound their blindness is. Most of their arguments are circular. Most of their starting premises are absurd and require time to run backward to make the logic work. Here's an example of how their argument might go. The Quran is perfectly clear, but where do you not understand the clear Quran? You should learn the story about how the Quran was revealed from sources written 200 to 500 years after Muhammad lived. You want to know how the Quran was written? Ask people who lived 400 to 900 years after Muhammad, because the Quran writers didn't tell us a story within 50 years of Muhammad's death. But don't worry. The characters were described and documented 100 years after Muhammad. It's no big deal that their stories grew more detailed and more complex over the next 800 years. All those details were there even 100 years after Muhammad's death. Trust me, bro. If these stories hundreds of years after Muhammad's death don't help, go to interpretations from 300 to 900 years after Muhammad, and often hundreds of years after the stories explaining the Quran's revelation. These interpretations add details and nuance to the story in the Quran that you can trust. Then you must accept their interpretations unquestionably. You're too stupid to know the real answer. Okay. Notice the order of authority? The more distant from Muhammad's death, the more authoritative in practice. If you ask any Muslim their theology of hierarchy, the hierarchy of authority, they'll always tell you something like Allah's revelation to Muhammad in the Quran, other collected scriptures in the Kitab revealed by God, but they're lost, so extant texts or existing texts are ignored as unreliable, such as the Torah and the Injil or Gospel. Then there's the traditions about Muhammad's experiences in the Hadith. Then there's the biography of Muhammad in the Surah, even if compiled by Western Europeans in the 19th century, but we'll ignore that. And the interpretations of the legal scholars in the tafsirs. Yet when they solve problems in theology or Sharia, they work from the bottom up. This seems counterintuitive to the lines of authority. But is Islam unique in this problem? Well, let's take a jump to comparative religion and comparative law on lines of authority and problem resolution. First, let's compare Judaism in the Second Temple period, before rabbinic dominance was unquestioned. What's their hierarchy of authority? 1, the written Torah, aka the Pentateuch. 2, the prophetic writings, all prophets classified as major and minor, except Daniel. The writings, or Psalms, including the Book of Psalms, the Book of Proverbs, Book of Chronicles, and the sole prophet in that section, the Book of Daniel. Most all non-Samaritan believers found all of these canonical. Then the debate begins in earnest. The rabbis would add oral tradition, also known as oral Torah. The Essenes would study non-canonical sources like those found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we mentioned one earlier, the Messianic Apocalypse. The priests would largely ignore all non-canonical books, although many of their writings may have been destroyed in the destruction of the temple's library, so we're guessing about that. After the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD, the rabbis effectively accomplished a coup d'etat, or at least a coup de overthrow of beliefs. The oral Torah became the definitive source of, quote, Torah study. To, quote, study the Torah, unquote, was to study the rabbis' opinions, not study the Pentateuch. They would still defend the Pentateuch as the supreme authority. Strangely, though, when the Pentateuch directly contradicted the rabbis' majority interpretation, the majority of rabbis had supreme authority in deciding the outcome. The Pentateuch became a de facto second fiddle to the rabbis' opinions, as sometimes documented in the writings about the oral Torah called the Talmud. This calcified in the written Talmud then became more important than the oral Torah as remembered, which was already more important than the Pentateuch. Remember, this is about how decisions are made. When conflicts in the writings concepts occur, which source is the yardstick that controls the final measurement? Imagine you have a job to build a house. You can use the metric system or imperial system of measures. The tools you select will work best if they're designed for the same system of measures. So if you're using imperial, your screwdrivers, tape measures, nails, and dimensional lumber work best if you stay with the imperial system all the way across. You don't need to constantly get out a calculator and convert measurements, then calculate the size of the carpentry cuts and placements. Instead, you measure twice and cut once. No conversions, far less confusion. Choosing a standard of measure and sticking with it allows greater integration and cohesion over the overall project. You don't need to end up with the great NASA satellite debacle. 2 engineering teams worked on one satellite. One used metric, the other imperial. The satellite launched and promptly failed. One half of the satellite could not work with the other because of slight discrepancies between the two halves. A consistent standard of measure does not guarantee perfect outcomes, but it does remove foreseeable causes of future confusion and conflict. Judaism has changed its standard of measurement, its yardstick, several times. First, it was a covenant with a single person, Abraham, and thereby to his household and descendants, with later modifications. Second, the change was to a covenant with the entire people of Israel as a nation at Sinai. Third, the change was to a covenant with the people of Israel through a king. Fourth was the change to a body of rabbis as the judicial and de facto legislative body of an ethnicity living outside the land of Israel. This group relied on judicial precedents and legislative decisions to define the measurements. Fifth, the change was to systematic philosophy and theology because the diaspora was too wide for a ruling body to function, and the larger body was living under Muslim rule with similar legal approaches. Sixth was to a mystical theological approach from a book supposedly found that dated before the rabbis, but whose wife, the writer's wife, is recorded as calling it a forgery. Seventh was to return to legalism reminiscent of the early rabbis, but with far more source material to draw upon. Eighth was a rejection of the mysticism, the messianism, and the legalism in favor of a 19th century philosophical system of thought with religious overtones. So which one is the true Judaism? Which one interpreted the Torah properly? What is the Torah? The Pentateuch, oral teachings of the rabbis, the documented teachings of those rabbis, the decisions of the council of rabbis, the philosophical teachings of later rabbis, the mystical teaching of a potentially forged scripture, modern philosophy taught to Jews alone? If we don't know what the Torah is, how do we know who taught it properly? How do we know what true Judaism is? Is true Judaism a set of beliefs or a shared bloodline? What if one has one but not the other? Can they be said to be part of the true Judaism? Now let's compare Roman Catholic Christianity. Orthodoxy has a different answer, but it's largely consistent with Rome, so I'll ignore it for the sake of simplicity, but at the cost of accuracy and completeness. What are the lines of authority in the Catholic Church? One is the Bible, as recognized by the patristic fathers in the 1st through 3rd centuries, and later formally canonized with identical content at the Council of Trent in the Counter-Reformation era. Then the writings of the patristic fathers, then the traditions of the church as established, then later recognized by ecumenical church councils, then the ruling of ecumenical councils, then the rulings of councils summoned by the Pope, but not quite fully ecumenical. Then there's decisions by synods. Then there's rulings by the Pope ex cathedra, meaning from the chair. Then there's canon law of the compiling all these proceeding and adding legal precedents from decisions, along with the long-standing traditions and practices of believers in the church. When various schisms took place, the Roman Catholic Church proclaimed itself as being the true root of the church. Based on membership alone as a standard of measure, the Catholic Church is the de facto center of gravity of Christian belief, even if the history of theology may debate who moved away from whom. The canon law attempts to compile everything into a coherent, legalistic structure for bureaucracy to manage and administer. In practice, then, the believer works from the canon law backward. If the canon law gives you the answer you seek, your research is complete. You accept the rule and move forward. If the canon law does not give you the answer you desire, your research moves backward up the lines of authority to find a different possible interpretation. When that fails, you move up another level. The pattern is up, seek outward to all resources at that level of authority, analyze. Did you get the desired answer? Nope. Up and outward again. Desired answer? Nope. Repeat. You're hunting for a desired precedent or rule. Now let's examine churches in various levels of schism from one another. Lines of authority? Well, the Bible is recommended by St. Jerome, the Vulgate translator in the 4th century, and re-emphasized by Martin Luther in the 16th century, and then the interpretation by believers. All done. As denominations proliferated, the believers used as reliable sources of interpretation tended to be the founders of those denominations. Some relied on patristic fathers in some parts, others did not. Some relied on ecumenical councils, others did not, or chose different councils' rulings. Churches in schism with one another had very different answers to the question of what was authoritative. Yet the supermajority of churches who claim no prophets after Jesus generally agree with St. Jerome's canon of Scripture as a common de minimis or minimum definition of the Bible. Many sects add books, but almost none subtract from St. Jerome's 66-book list. When these churches resolve problems in doctrine, their research is far shorter and usually far less bureaucratic than Roman canon law methods. Yet the process is the same. Begin at the end and move back up the chain of authority to seek preferred outcomes. The trip is just far shorter because there's less material to choose from. Now let's compare the American legal system. What are the authorities? Well, first you have the U.S. Constitution. Then you have federal statutes and case law within federal constitutional authority. Then you have state constitutions, depending on the location of the dispute. Then you have precedents that were accepted from England into the federal government and state levels. Then you have state statutes and case law for locations of disputes. Then you have local ordinances as local legislative laws. Then you have customary practices as dictated by executive authorities' orders. Now, I've heavily simplified these for doctrinal issues. Finding the exact source, such as administrative law and procedure authorized by statute, creates sublevels of authority, but I'm going to ignore that for the sake of simplicity. If a citizen has a problem, he will do the same up and outward research pattern until he finds an answer. With all of these examples in hand, we can see a legalistic approach, whether religious-based or secular-based, has the same problem. The line of authority goes from the top down, creating a natural workflow that works most efficiently for a citizen or a complainant to pursue their preferred solutions from the bottom upward. This bottom-up approach is not the line of authority. It is the problem-solving heuristic. It is most efficient to use the lowest level of authority to answer your question or solve your problem. So when a religion teaches its novice students, they are inevitably going to use the bottom-up approach. The goal is quick and simple answers to frequently asked questions, or FAQs. There is no reason to write an academic paper for a novice about how do I join. The novice wants simple and quick answers. As a novice grows to an intermediate student, the complexity of the questions grow, and the history of the theological problem solving is explained in greater depth. Similarly, a citizen trying to obtain a building permit is going to be exposed to more rules and complexities of everyday bureaucracy, but they won't be exposed to constitutional issues about why the bureaucracy is organized the way it is, or why a certain supervisor can make some decisions and not others. So Islam is not unique in the problem of solving from the bottom up. It is inherent in a heuristic to confronting rules. It would be stupid for any person who lives within a system and accepts its premises to do otherwise. It's a wasted effort. Why? That system is dominant and unyielding. It's self-preserving. For a petitioner, the goal is usually to accomplish a concrete goal. The petitioner can attempt to accomplish his immediate goal quickly. The petitioner can seek to overturn the system, but the system will fight back viciously to maintain its authority. The petitioner's goal cannot be accomplished during that fight. So a petitioner has a choice. It has to choose the priority of accomplishment of his immediate goal or the eventual overturning of the system. He cannot have both. If you're introducing a seeker to your religion, is this practical approach persuasive? Not really. Outsiders don't understand why traditions or precedents should have any moral authority on anyone. They make no sense if they do not have unstated higher principle-based rationales explained. Believers often struggle to explain their faith because they can explain it from the bottom up. Believers already know the higher authority. They never consider their daily experience from the purely theoretic and moral starting point. It just is. For outsiders, these mundane decisions about how to live and act seem completely arbitrary and capricious if the believer does not teach the subject from the top down. Christians are often the best at general theology. They have grown up with the faith being a response to Second Temple Jewish debates. The points of contrast between Judaism and Christianity are foundational to the Christian faith. It simply comes down to Jesus was in fights with the Pharisees, who were the early rabbis, and the Sadducees, who were the priests of the temple. So those debates between those three groups drive the storyline of the Gospels. Jews are far less well-founded in their beliefs. They know the laws and the growth of Judaism. They're trained to be actively avoidant of anything Christian. This leaves them extremely ignorant of the culture that surrounds them every day. They are trained to ask their rabbis when they have a question, not research, rely on expert opinions. In an era of limited scholarly resources, that's good advice. Just imagine, in an era where a book might have cost $100, if you need to get answers to questions like this, it may take an entire library costing thousands. Who has the money and time to read all those books? Better to ask somebody that knows the answers. But in a world like today, where we are filled with detailed resources, this is a call to cultic indoctrination and refusal to see and witness the surrounding world with independent eyes. Jews have learned to cooperate and live in a foreign culture to their beliefs, yet for the most part they are willfully blind to the outside world. Muslims, in contrast, are very loud and proud of their beliefs, but they know very little because their culture discourages academic inquiry or philosophical reasoning. In fact, Sharia, as stated in al-Mizri's Reliance of the Traveler, published in 1368, actively prohibits reasoning except for trained scholars. This means the entire deen, that is, structure of Islamic governance, is based on cultic indoctrination and brainwashing. Islam depends upon a religion-wide blindness to the outside world. Lies propagate easily among the blind who cannot witness the falsity of their beliefs. If you cannot perceive how others see the world, you cannot understand how to explain your own beliefs from the top down. You assume basic philosophical or theological points to be so foundational as to be self-obvious. But to an outsider, these assumptions are far from self-obvious. This can be seen by use of undefined buzzwords. A believer who doesn't understand the other person's worldview just assumes everyone understands vocabulary exactly as he does. So hidden assumptions are buried in unstated definitions. Christians insist on something called prolegomenon, basic knowledge prerequisites to the study of theology. A Christian must learn logic and reasoning before studying theology. Jews often come to this knowledge through scientific or secular philosophy. Their history of yeshiva debates allow an adeptness at acquiring this type of knowledge and using it in practice. Christians tend to use theory more than debate, so it is less confrontational in most circumstances, although Christians then are less adept at being able to argue their points. The core problem that Islam has in any debate is that it is blind to its own status. Muslims arrogate to themselves or claim for themselves supreme authority over all other people. They proclaim the Quran as an authority for all mankind because the Quran claims that authority for itself. Since the Islamic line of authority is believed to be true, the Quran should be the authority. Muslims sometimes pretend to be just cooperating with the existing premises of American constitutionalism or Christian worldview ethical premises. They attempt to co-opt those systems to claim for themselves a parallel and non-competing area of authority. In actual fact, Muslims are blind to their lines of authority, are of zero relevance to anyone outside of Islam. Remember, they don't think there is anything outside of Islam. So the opinions of others is immaterial to their thinking, other than an obstacle to be surmounted. Muslims are blind to their system of thought that has no place of purchase within Western civilization. Islam can only displace Western civilization by establishing Sharia cooperatives within mosques or establishing Sharia neighborhoods. The point is to expel Western civilization from those quarters. Then the goal is to grow those quarters and expand their territories of control. Islam is blind to the fact its line of authority is a completely incoherent and illogical construct. While my prior analysis suggested that authority goes from the top down and problem solving from the bottom up, that does not deal with the core problem that Islam's authorities have a built-in flaw. Almost all of the other systems I have described move from a central premise to more detailed answers using existing stories. Sharia is built on an incoherent authority. Some scholars say every fifth sentence of the Quran is gibberish in Arabic. Sharia then needs later explanations to fix the gibberish. The methodology appears to have been to invent stories and retroject them or send them backward in history to explain the gibberish. Thus, fiction is treated as history. Myth becomes precedent. To make matters worse, competing fictions and myths by feuding groups resulted in contradictory precedents. So later interpreters had to try to add a post facto rationalization or after the fact rationalization for the competing precedents arising from competing myths. Is this the same process as elsewhere? Well, yes, in many U.S. Supreme Court cases like Plessy versus Ferguson or the Dred Scott decision were based on fictions that did not hold up well. The difference is that the U.S. legal system doesn't simply declare that some new version of the Dred Scott story fixes everything. There is a review of historical materials that the current litigants cannot alter. The evidence, more thoroughly examined, changes starting premises. Changes starting premises, not the underlying story of Dred Scott. The philosophy shifts while his story remains the same. Change and reinterpretation are inevitable. The question is whether those foundational premises are based on unchangeable and objective facts or on conveniently new invented stories about a past character who becomes increasingly fictional and adaptive to every then modern problem. The Islamic method layers fiction upon fiction. Marxism too trades in adding fictions and changing past histories to fit the modern narrative. The Russian security services called this historical necrophagy, that is, eating of the dead. If you want to see more about that, I would recommend Ion Pacepa's books. He was the former head of the Romanian intelligence services during the Cold War. The Western method seeks to strip away fiction after fiction. By removing falsehoods, such as through falsifying hypotheses in science, the hope is we become in greater possession of the truer and purer. Can humans err in the pursuit of removing falsehoods? Yeah, but that's a separate topic. A system that depends on adding falsehoods in order to buttress its lines of authority is inherently incapable of discovering truth. A system that depends on removing falsehoods and undermining lines of authority built on those falsehoods is the only means of reliably approaching truth. We will never arrive at truth. It's like a mathematical concept. It approaches an infinite boundary condition, but never arrives. The goal is not to speak truth. The goal is to remove falsehoods through speech. The significance of Jesus' resurrection to theology is almost unique in human history. If Jesus died and did not resurrect, Christianity is false. Christians are fools. Our lives are in pursuit of a lie. If Jesus did not die but went straight to heaven, as most Muslims claim, Christianity is false. But if Jesus did die and did resurrect, then he has unique insights about the nature of existence that no other human being has ever had. No one. Should we listen to such a person? If not, why not? It would seem stupid not to consider Jesus' teachings as closer to truth than anything we can figure out by ourselves. If we should listen to him, why should we not listen to his explanations of why his resurrection was possible and what it meant? Once we start considering his words as authoritative, why should we not also accept his interpretation of the prior scriptures as being a more authoritative source, since he claims to speak for the divine source of those scriptures? If his interpretations conflict with rabbis who die and don't resurrect, should we choose the resurrected Jesus' interpretation over the dead rabbis? Same rationale as above. Jesus' resurrection is the point of entry to Christian theology. Nothing else of the gospel has great meaning until a questioner confronts the evidence of the resurrection. Who cares whether Jesus claimed to be God and how he did, if his words come from an unreliable source? Who cares whether there is a Trinity or not, if the claimant is not credible? Only once the resurrection is considered true is the rest of the gospel and New Testament explanatory. Notice explanatory. Many different incidents recorded could all be true. How do we know they're not doing cosplay to become credible as potential usurpers of Roman authority? But if the resurrection is true, everything that Jesus could be remembered to have said and done is a potential source of information and learning. It's a step closer to finding truth. What is the equivalent entry point for Islam? Muhammad died and stayed dead, we're told. Never mind, some believe he never existed to have been able to die in the first place. Why should he be any different than the dead rabbis? Same rationale. Either way, Muhammad's death is not an entry point to Islam. Muhammad said things to followers. So did every other teacher in history. Why was Muhammad's teachings more significant? If Muhammad conquered an empire, does that make him the viceroy of God on earth? Why is every other emperor, including Augustus Caesar, not able to make the same or more far-reaching claim? We've already noted how garbled the Arabic is according to scholars, so the, quote, miracle of the Quran could be said as, it's a miracle that anyone thinks it's coherent. Yet the oracles of Delphi were known for confusing prophecies, and people would bring valuable gifts from all over Greater Greece to hear more confusing prophecies. So clarity is often not a hallmark of people finding religious significance. Quite the opposite. Whether Muhammad met an archangel or not depends entirely on Muhammad's own claims. There's no meeting on Sinai of 70 other witnesses. There are no other eyewitnesses who wrote a third-party account. There is nothing objectively unique about Muhammad's claims. Islam has no credible entry point to belief. This means the authority of the writings have no hold on anyone until they choose to enter Islam. So to begin believing is to choose Islam first. Islam then is not based on evidence. It's based on accepting another's power over you. In contrast, Judaism and Christianity have claims of eyewitnesses documented by participants. You don't have to believe the theology at all until after you confront the evidence. Judaism's evidence of generations acting as if a divine covenant exists, and their own breaches of those covenants correlate with investigative research. Archaeology and epigraphy and many other disciplines can establish Jewish existence and cultural patterns consistent with this divine covenant theology. This evidence lasts for around 1200 to 1400 years, depending on your interpretation of the findings. You can doubt the Sinai meeting with the Assembly of Israel, but the evidence of Israelite belief in that relationship is extraordinarily well documented and corroborated. This does not make their belief and interpretation true. It only establishes the constitutional mindset of the people for a millennium. Strangely, the archaeological evidence of Israelite successes and failures align very well with the bibliological evidence of Israelite successes and failures align well with the archaeological evidence. Periods of praying to foreign gods did coincide up to when the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed. Could it have been an explanation written after the fact? Sure. Does it succinctly prove Judaism true? No. A core problem that Judaism had was a provable point of entry. Abraham's experience was too anecdotal and singular to himself and distant in time. Isaac and Jacob had to relearn the same lessons. Moses' experience temporarily solved the problem by having the assembly of Israel present. But as those participants died off, how would any non-participants be able to maintain the evidence of credibility? What type of chain of custody of evidence did they provide? Little to none except Moses' writings. And even if he could have authored the whole story, there is no surviving witness accounts to compare. God needed to keep reintroducing himself to every generation because the younger generation had not witnessed their grandparents' experiences. It became legend. This ebb and flow of belief created many eddies of contradictory beliefs in succeeding generations. Conflict increased, evidence seemed to become contradictory or forgotten, new false evidence was manufactured to support agendas. If you could design a way for all of mankind to come to believing a central truth, how would you design it? Would you have an archangel appear in a cave to one man? Would you focus your efforts on one people so the stories of the father's generation is passed down to the son's generation? The story consistent but with growing interconnected layers? Would you have a remarkable single event witnessed by friend and foe alike, documented by different witnesses and historians, and completely different than any other event in human history? What if details of the event were beyond the participants' control, but predicted and documented more than 200 years before the event? How would you design the memory of the event to be as immune from alteration and rewriting? Would you have one master writing put in a vault or buried at the Dead Sea? Would you have many copies of the story spread across the known world as fast as you could in many languages? Would you have had writers quoting those same stories nearly conceptually identically in different languages from France to Syria within 70 years of the event? Would you have antagonistic historians trying to describe the event within the same century? What if one of the historians was likely writing from imperial archival records? True or not, the bureaucrats of the era would have believed the event true. Would you have the key stories told in an established genre intended to convey precision and accuracy, or a rambling poetic style that favors ease of recitation over substance? So if we look at Islam and the other comparative religions, Islam is shockingly devoid of any pre-belief evidence. If you start with the skeptic's eye with the Torah, writings, Gospels, Acts, and the Epistles, you can do archaeology, history, and scientific confirmation. This is external evidence. Long-lost historical data was preserved and confirmed millennia after the original evidence disappeared. How would later writers tell accurate stories without evidence? If you start with the skeptic's eye with the Quran, what external evidence supports Islam? No city of Mecca in the archaeological record until a century after Muhammad supposedly lived there. No evidence of major trade practices in the region of modern Mecca, so the biography of Muhammad doesn't make any sense. There's no evidence of the Quran's existence in whole or in part until 50 years or more after his life. Arguably no evidence of a fully compiled book called a Quran for over 150 years after his life. The first evidence of surahs are as standalone books, not as chapters of a compiled book. The second evidence is of standalone Qurans, not containing all the surahs, but varying surahs, so arbitrary compilations. Third is the late evidence of a fully compiled single-volume Quran, but no canon of surahs. So there were differences in what the contents were. Dating is made more difficult through carbon-14 analysis because Arabia and the Middle East are in a notoriously difficult region to index and establish historical values. It's between the Northern Hemisphere index and the Southern Hemisphere index. And as the change of season happens, the variation of which hemisphere's carbon-14 load hits Arabia creates value discrepancies. So we have no reliable index of valuables to do actual dating on these Muslim materials. No concurrent political power has any government record of any interactions or events not occurring in Arabia near Mecca or Medina. Does that mean that nothing occurred? It does mean that nothing worthy of note caught bureaucrats' attention. So a sudden imperial conquest is not substantiated from foreign sources. Contrast that to Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, and about 6 other Roman historians talking about Jesus. Unlike Christians being blamed for the fire of Rome 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion, no evidence of followers of Muhammad impacted the outside world in a meaningful way until around 50 years after Muhammad's supposed lifetime. Even then, no biographical story is part of the picture for over a century or more. Surahs appear in this period, but little biographical content. So where is the skeptic to begin looking into the history of Muhammad to assess its historiographic validity, its ability to be put together as a credible story using evidentiary methods? The story is not credible. The credibility of the evidence supporting the story just isn't there. The closest thing is the Constitution of Medina, but it has all the hallmarks of a 10th century forgery, including references to stories that were not yet written in the 7th century. The current efforts are focused on Arabic script rock inscriptions, but none of those reference any language similar to Quranic passages until after 700 AD, more than 70 years after Muhammad's supposed death. Prior to 70 AD, there are only vague references to a generic monotheism. More recent research has claimed to have found names from the Muhammad story, but little else of any Islamic character. No archaeology is now even possible in Mecca because the Saudis recently destroyed all soil layers down to the bedrock to build skyscrapers around the Grand Mosque. There will now never be Meccan archaeology. The supposed homes of characters in the Sunnah were destroyed in the process. There is no evidence of a so-called classical Arabic or Quranic Arabic prior to the publication of the Quran. So the evidence can be interpreted as suggesting that the Quran invented the language. The writing conventions of some texts tend to be most similar to the court of Abd al-Malik, who died around 710 AD. The real explosion of the concept of Muslim, Muhammad, Quran, and Hadith is after 750 AD, when the Arab Umayyads were conquered by the more intellectually sophisticated Persian Abbasids. Early on, Shabani, who died in 805, wrote his legal opinions. The focus was on the opinion of legal scholars. Only after Shali who died in 822, and the supposed discovery of authentic traditions of Muhammad in the 770s, were isnad jurisprudential rules established. Then the explosion of Islamic schools occurred, especially with Ibn Hanbal being the earliest, who died in 855. The demand for credibility in early precedents was to go to the companions of Muhammad, which is still true. Most of the most reliable hadith still fit this methodology. Then the compilations of people like Musananif al-Razak started to change things. More importantly, we lack any documentation that would allow us to study any Umayyad legal practices. In fact, no literature or evidence of Islamic culture exists except art. The intellectual rigor improved dramatically. The output exploded both in volume of pages and in the volume of words to describe any detail. Whether the stories were forged or not, the opportunity for chicanery grew dramatically. So, in the midst of this 9th century explosion, there was a new demand for legal principles that could be traced back to Muhammad himself. With that demand, suddenly and conveniently, there was an explosion of hadith tracing every precedent back to Muhammad, not the companions. The companions were now just the communication pathway. Professor Patricia Crone of Oxford and Cambridge had concluded the evidence shows, quote, lawyers determined what the prophet said, not the other way around, unquote. Effectively, the hadith were not based on what was remembered, but on what was wished had been remembered. The lawyers put their arguments into Muhammad as described by the prophet's own mouth. If Bukhari collected 600,000 hadith and preserved 7,000, the odds favor hadith being unreliable more than reliable. Scholars are widely reputed to manufacture hadith, so why would any a priori assumption of a hadith be reliable? The hadith authenticity rating depends on the credibility of the lawyer, not the reliability of Muhammad as defined by the preacher's words. This jurisprudential analysis only begins to be possible 100 years after the Hijrah, so roughly about 722 AD. If an inquisitive skeptic runs into this problem, why would the skeptic be more persuaded that Islam has a credible historic background? The skeptical academic cannot substantiate the history of Islam with any similarity to the traditions or biography of Muhammad as defined by the preacher. The evidence is that Muhammad as defined by the preacher was constructed out of pieces and parts across centuries, which do not include the key years of 610 to 632 AD. It only begins after 680 AD, more precisely around 690 AD. It surges several times around 700, 720, 770, 810, 830, and then it finally has gained its momentum. The distillation of this story continued well into the 1600s, but its impact on surrounding communities was well on its way. Now, this is not a discussion of whether Umayyad or Abbasid empires existed. They did. That evidence is fairly credibly established. The question is, what did they believe and what was their culture like? Persian culture spread to the Iberian Peninsula after 710 AD. It changed the architectural expectations. We still see the Persian architecture today, but is misattributed as Moorish. This label begs the question, when did Islam actually arrive in Spain? If Islam was not fully formed for several more decades or centuries, how could it have arrived in Spain before it was formed? Compounding the problem, the Song of Roland described the Battle of Tours in 735 AD. It described fighting the Saracens, not Muslims. No mention is ever made of a prophet. No mention is made of Islam. The major blockage of the Moors into France and no mention of their supposed defining characteristics is the key to the story. But we're looking from today backward. and we're superimposing our modern understanding back onto a story that doesn't say these things. As noted above, Professor Crone flatly states the Hadith did not exist until the Abbasid period after 750 AD. Still, half a century or more later, the role of Muhammad as the defining character finally arose. It shows all the evidence of lawyers and judges making up rationales for their desired judicial outcomes by using spontaneously created and self-serving hadith. So none of this material can credibly answer what their actual cultural beliefs were. The documents are too late in time and too unreliable under this paradigm. The standard Islamic narrative is devoid of credible historical evidence. A non-Muslim is intellectually justified in providing a historiographically focused external critique. This disqualifies any and all Qurans, Hadith, Sunnah, etc. from consideration unless and until any historiographically credible material is presented. Does this mean that Christian apologists should refuse to engage in debate about the theological or religious consequences of Islamic doctrine and practice? No. The best way to collapse a house made of wooden carpentry is the introduction of termites and carpenter ants, just above the concrete foundations. The constant eating away at the most basic wooden support will be a slow deterioration of its internal structural integrity. The house will not collapse in bits and pieces. It will collapse all of a sudden. It might be a strong gust of wind. It might be a tornado. It might be a hurricane. These are all external forces that overwhelm an existent but weakening structural integrity. The house collapse may happen on a warm, sunny summer day with a light breeze because the sheer weight of the house can no longer be supported. Once any part of the house collapses, the cross stresses that suddenly form could pull down any other weakened supports or full strength but overwhelmed supports. A partial collapse can quickly become a complete collapse. What does this teach us about polemical attacks intended to remove bad ideas? Multiple points of simultaneous attack are effective at causing overwhelming damage to falsehoods. Islam is built on doctrines filled with falsehoods. Its believers are propagandized to be belligerent and seek out confrontations so they can claim victimhood and attack in retaliation before any truth can be addressed. Islam has succeeded to date because its scriptures and beliefs have been hidden from the civilized world. All Westerners knew about Islam is what Muslims summarized their beliefs to be. No documentation in Western languages of note. Arabic collections were large and expensive. If Muslims lied or were poorly educated, Westerners had no means to assess the reply or argue anything differently. Yet in the 21st century, all of that material was online for free and translated into Western languages, sometimes with dozens of translations. Muslims' lies or low education are now transparent and obvious, with a modicum of Western scholarship focused on Arab and Muslim history, quote unquote. Attacking these lies and ignorant claims undermines the starting premises of Muslim beliefs. Logical constructs built on these false starting premises will not collapse immediately, but the foundations are nearly gone. The termites and carpenter ant phase is almost over. The collapse is imminent. Debate and engagement in a civil manner is the most effective dual-purpose method. They speed the termites and carpenter ants' work with each individual duped Muslim. They also place constant pressure on Muslims' confidence in their beliefs and invite inquisitive doubts. Remember from earlier, anger and anxiety block rational thought and learning. Engaging Muslims to provoke widespread anger creates resistance, not doubt or learning. Formal debates with individual Muslims or small groups, say 2 to 4 people, using commonly known rules of order and procedure, allow for individuals to become angered. Yet the anger quickly starts to look misdirected and unhinged when there is a quiet audience or less agitated co-debaters. The anger becomes a stumbling block for the angry's argument and its credibility. Debate and engagement should provoke and unsettle, even to the level of mild agitation. Threats of physical violence should be met with steady and quiet resolve. Turn the left cheek. to make the point clearer with Jesus, that is, the first slap to the right cheek from a right-handed person had to be backhanded. This is a way to demean slaves as lesser persons. The Jesus response is to step into the fight and do a rumble in the jungle rope-a-dope. Offer the left cheek. If he's going to attack again, force him to use his right hand with the forehand, the open hand slap, or a right hook. The answer is not retreat or putting up your hands in defense. It is to risk the real hit without defenses. Loving your enemy is to force him to overcome his blindness by opening his eyes to truth. If you do get punched and don't retaliate, most bullies' egos will be more offended that you were stronger-willed than he. He will ruminate on his Pyrrhic victory for potentially years. He will be humiliated. Is this Jesus' way? Muhammad raised armies to despotically impose his will on neighboring communities. If the Quran and Hadith are historically reliable, Jesus sent his apostles out in pairs to preach. Why pairs? In Rabbinic Judaism, from 151 BC to 10 AD, the leadership of the Sanhedrin was in pairs. The chief or prince of the Sanhedrin was called the Nasi, and the master or father of the court, as second in command, the lead scholar, also known as the Av Bet Din, led these organizations in pairs. It's hard to say historically, but based on later medieval yeshiva schools that had students work in pairs to help one another learn and practice debates, if we were to use the existence of those pair learnings and retroject it back to Jesus, it would seem to make sense that Jesus would send his students out in pairs too. So, is a pair the basic foundation for Jewish learning throughout history? We don't know. But it seems appropriate. So, if it was the culture, having a pair of students traveling around together throughout Judea and the Galilee may have seemed normal when the apostles were doing it. But a pair carrying no weaponry hardly seems to be a military recruiter or threat. Powerful words could be preached, but no lawful authority would have been able to declare a physical or military threat. When the group of 12 disciples did travel with Jesus, they were instructed to have only 2 swords for the entire entourage. Again, no physical or military threat, only ability to provide the group some defense against highwaymen and robbers. Jesus was forceful in word and unwillingness to back down despite working to constantly emphasize the lack of military threat. But why avoid a military threat? If Rome was the lawful government, being a military threat directly challenged Roman legitimacy. The proper punishment for military threats under Roman law was execution by crucifixion. Jesus would have been lawfully executed as an insurgent. But Jesus was supposed to be completely innocent, like a sacrificial Paschal or Passover lamb, when he was killed. It is theologically critical in Christianity. The execution had to be legally baseless, so military threats were unacceptable.